opens lines for queen and bishop, immediately seizing central real estate for influence. Instantly mirroring white's central occupation, black aims for an equal footing and immediate counterplay. Developing a knight to attack the central pawn sets up an immediate confrontation and prepares for rapid kingside castling. Developing the knight here solidifies central control and prepares for castling, a standard and sensible response. Opening the center now, white bravely challenges the pawn chain, creating immediate dynamic possibilities and a fight for central space. Striking at the center pawn immediately, black opens lines for their pieces, daring white to commit their own forces. Recapturing the pawn with the knight immediately contests central squares and prepares to launch a swift initiative. Developing the bishop here creates immediate diagonal pressure, challenging white's central control and preparing for rapid kingside castling. Retreating the knight frees the c-pawn for advancement, creating a strategic foothold on the queen side. Consolidating the bishop to this diagonal secures its long-term influence and prepares for potential central pawn advances. Consolidating piece activity, this knight aims to pressure the central d5 square and potentially redeploy to g5, eyeing black's kingside, while also offering an escape route should the pawn structure in the center shift drastically. Developing the knight to f6 now directly contests white's central pawn and begins to prepare for castling, a crucial step in solidifying the king's safety and activating the rook. This centralizing impulse is often a cornerstone of sound opening play, aiming to bring pieces into the game harmoniously. Preparing to castle kingside while keeping an eye on the bishop on b6, this maneuver subtly aims to consolidate the central pawn structure and potentially launch an attack down the kingside files once the queen is safely tucked away. Opening a pathway for the queen on the queen side, a bold bid for queenside space that immediately challenges white's center and aims to outmaneuver the knight. Suddenly, the knight leaps to the edge, a bold gambit to disrupt black's bishop control and potentially seize control of the queenside. Castling secures the king behind a wall of pawns and prepares to bring the rook into central play, a logical step towards activating all pieces. Sharpening the attack, this bishop sortie immediately challenges the defender of the d5 square, aiming to create disruptions in black's harmonious development. Observe how the diagonal pressure on the queen side might soon escalate. Challenging the bishop's current placement with h6 creates a dialogue about piece activity and defensive structures, forcing white to decide whether to retreat the knight or initiate a more aggressive pawn confrontation that might open lines towards your king. Sacrificing the bishop's influence on the diagonal opens a path for your rook, aiming to seize the now weakened kingside. This exchange fundamentally alters the positional landscape, creating immediate pressure on black's castled king. Your goal is to exploit the exposed pawn structure and develop a swift attack before black can consolidate. Unveiling your queen, you embrace the challenge of white's disrupted pawn structure, aiming to exploit the open lines that will soon arise, a bold gambit for initiative. Claiming central space with this pawn thrust immediately challenges black's queen's pawn and opens a diagonal for the queen, potentially aiming for the kingside. Unshackling the queen's bishop from its pawn protection, this maneuver creates immediate pressure on white's queenside pawns while simultaneously preparing to contest the central files as the game opens up. Solidifying the center with this pawn push, white shores up the d4 square and prepares for potential pawn advances on the kingside, aiming to restrict black's developing pieces. The knight leaps to d4, immediately challenging white's central pawn structure and aiming to disrupt the coordinated piece play that white has been meticulously building. This aggressive positioning not only questions the knight's initial foray to a4, but also sets up potential forks on c2 and e2, forcing white to carefully consider how to defend these threats while also tending to the now exposed kingside. Black's intention is clearly to seize the initiative and introduce tactical complexities. Shifting the queen to d3 aims to challenge black's central control and potentially exploit the slightly misplaced knight on d4 by offering a queen trade, which might simplify the position favorably for white if black's king safety is a concern later on. A surprising exchange, casting aside the powerful knight that guarded the kingside, opening a strategic debate about piece activity versus pawn structure, as black aims to simplify and perhaps pressure the central pawn chain. Opening the file with this capture immediately presents white's rook with active participation, potentially pressuring black's queenside pawn structure down the line. A daring foray, this bishop advances into enemy territory, directly challenging white's central control and aiming to disrupt white's pawn structure after a potential exchange. Bringing the knight back to its starting square aims to reroute it to a more active square, perhaps c2, b4, or even intending to defend the d4 pawn if black were to directly attack it, while simultaneously freeing the c-file for potential pawn advances. Black solidifies the central pawn structure, establishing a resilient pawn chain and preparing to contest the crucial d4 square. This maneuver subtly aims to restrict white's knight outposts and opens avenues for the queenside pieces to become more active. Prioritizing piece activity over pawn structure, white repositions a knight with the intention of re-establishing pressure on the queenside. Solidifying central presence, black anchors the d-pawn, creating a robust pawn chain and preparing to develop the light-squared bishop more actively, potentially to e6 or f5. The knight's repositioning to b5 creates an immediate pressure point on black's queenside, potentially forcing a concession or awkward defensive maneuvering to protect the c7 square and the pawn chain. Snatching that pawn on b2, black ignites a fascinating positional drama, creating immediate complications by disrupting white's pawn structure and opening up the queenside. The bold exchange, however, leaves the black king somewhat exposed, as the g-file now presents a potential avenue for white's attack. This gambit-like approach forces white to carefully consider their response. Any misstep could lead to a rapid development of black's initiative. Asserting control over the open d-file with the rook immediately begins to pressure black's uncastled king's pawn and challenges the bishop's foray to b2, forcing a decision about that active piece. The rook emerges from its protective castling shelter, establishing a presence on an open file, a bold maneuver that immediately demands white's attention and begins to contest central influence. Securing the monarch by tucking it behind pawns signals a strategic shift toward fortifying the king's safety, a crucial consideration given the open nature of the center and the potential for future tactical skirmishes. This maneuver also prepares the rook to become an active participant on the kingside, potentially supporting an attack or defending against one. Bringing the bishop back to a defensive post, black seeks to secure the king and prepare for potential pawn advances by white. This retreat shores up the kingside while keeping the bishop actively placed on the long diagonal, albeit temporarily blocked by its own pawns. It hints at a desire to weather white's current pressure and perhaps regroup for a counteroffensive, prioritizing safety over immediate aggressive intent. Exploiting the momentarily exposed c7 square, the knight plunges deep into enemy territory, creating immediate tactical threats against the queen and bishop. Black decisively reclaims the initiative with a forcing sequence, aiming to dismantle white's pawn structure and open lines towards the exposed king. The bishop's journey to d4 isn't just a recapture. It's a surgical strike designed to disrupt white's central control and expose weaknesses that have been subtly developing since the early exchanges. This bold maneuver creates immediate tactical questions for white, forcing them to address the check while simultaneously considering the long-term consequences of their compromised pawn formation. Safeguarding the monarch from the immediate check, this maneuver effectively redirects the king's attention from the exposed d-file, subtly reinforcing the defensive structure and allowing for potential reorganization of pieces, perhaps aiming to contest the open d-file or prepare for pawn advancement on the kingside, thereby initiating a patient positional buildup. This retreat of the rook allows black to reinforce the d-file, preparing for a potential struggle for control of that crucial open lane, and potentially offering the rook a more active post on the 7th rank should white's pawn structure on the kingside falter. After meticulously maneuvering pieces and creating a complex pawn structure, white boldly injects a knight into the heart of black's position. This aggressive placement not only contests the valuable d4 square, but also forces black to immediately address the threat, potentially disrupting their carefully developed coordination and opening new avenues for white's attack. The queen strategically relocates, seeking active squares and preparing to contest the d-file, a clear indication of black's intention to generate counterplay. Reshuffling the knight to a more active central outpost, aiming to pressure black's queenside pawns and potentially support a king's side attack, while also providing an escape square for the king should the center open up. Seeking to dislodge the intrusive knight and activate the light-squared bishop, black repositions their bishop to a more active diagonal. This maneuver creates a more robust defensive pawn structure for the kingside and prepares for potential advances on the queenside. The knight at d4, though well placed, is now under direct threat, forcing white to consider its defense or retreat. Simultaneously, the bishop on c6 now eyes the b7 pawn, adding a subtle layer of queenside pressure. Challenging black's tenacious bishop outpost at d4, white unleashes the knight to a more active square, potentially eyeing the kingside or reinforcing central control, while simultaneously probing for weaknesses in black's pawn structure after the exchange on b3. Shifting the bishop to a more passive diagonal allows white's knight to maintain its outpost on f5, potentially supporting a later g4 push. A thoughtful repositioning, aiming to free the rook from its passive defensive stance on the d-file and initiate potential action on the second rank or across the board. Challenging the queen's outpost immediately, this advance aims to disrupt white's pawn structure and potentially open lines for counterplay, but it also weakens the queenside pawn advance later. Opening that queenside file with the pawn grab immediately puts pressure on black's queenside structure, creating a potential target while simultaneously developing white's own queenside pawns into a more active, albeit somewhat exposed, position. A bold repositioning of the rook, eyeing the now open file and creating immediate pressure against white's pawns. Centralizing the rook on the d-file shores up this crucial pathway, creating a potential battery with the queen and adding pressure to black's d-pawn, which now becomes a weak point in the pawn structure. The bishop retreats, a prudent sidestep from the immediate danger zone, but this maneuver doesn't resolve the underlying structural weaknesses black faces. Observe how white's pieces are now poised to exploit the open lines that have materialized, particularly the file, which suddenly presents an avenue for a decisive assault on the queen side. Consider the implications of the bishop's current inactivity. It's no longer contributing to the defense of the king or exerting pressure on white's central pawns. Refocusing the queen on the central squares now attempts to break the blockade and generate activity on the queen side, potentially eyeing squares like c7 or even supporting a pawn push. Reclaiming that bishop to a more active square suddenly amplifies black's ability to coordinate defensive forces, aiming to solidify its pawn structure and deter white's persistent pressure on the kingside. Reasserting central pressure, this maneuver aims to dislodge black's surprisingly active bishop and potentially open lines towards the kingside, despite sacrificing some immediate pawn structure. Instantly, the rooks align on the open file, a powerful demonstration of black's newfound pressure along the file, aiming to dismantle white's pawn structure. The rook exchange on the file severs black's last attempt at creating dynamic counterplay with that piece, simplifying into a more solid, albeit passive, position. A daring recapture, re-establishing material equality and opening up lines on the queen side, though it invites potential counterplay along the now exposed file if white can quickly regroup. Initiating a daring pawn storm on the king side, white seeks to shatter black's defensive pawn shield and create attacking avenues, even at the cost of weakening their own king's immediate safety. Solidifying the kingside structure becomes paramount now. The pawn push aims to prevent white's pieces from infiltrating further, but it might create weaknesses on the dark squares for black's monarch in the long run. Unleashing a pawn storm on the kingside now, aiming to pry open lines and expose the enemy monarch to swift, decisive attack. The black queen repositions to join the queenside fray, eyeing the vulnerable pawn structure white has just created. This maneuver aims to exploit the exposed white king, which now feels decidedly less secure after the pawn push. Black seeks to galvanize the queenside attack, potentially creating threats against the c4 pawn or even probing deeper into white's territory. The queen's relocation also offers flexibility, preparing for potential exchanges or consolidating defensive duties if white chooses to counterattack. It's a dynamic decision that reflects the evolving nature of the board, shifting focus from the center to a more direct assault on white's king's safety. The king shuffles backward, seeking a safer harbor behind the pawn's storm, but this repositioning feels tentative, leaving a subtle void on the king side for future exploitation. Recognizing the open lines leading to your monarch, this maneuver strategically repositions the bishop to solidify defense and prepare for potential counterplay, creating a robust pawn shield. Exposing the king by opening the h-file creates a dangerous, albeit temporary, tactical opportunity that white seizes, hoping to disrupt black's defensive setup and potentially exploit any lingering piece imbalances. Opening up that g-file creates a dynamic, albeit risky, situation as the kings eye each other from a distance. Your pawn push, while a necessary defense against the immediate pressure, now leaves your king slightly exposed on the queen side. White's rook on the file will be a constant thorn. The immediate exchange on g5 is a logical concession, trading a central pawn for potentially more open lines later. Keep a sharp eye on white's pieces. That knight on f5 is a potent attacking force, and your king needs careful protection from further infiltration. Reclaiming the open d-file presents an immediate objective, aiming to pry open black's somewhat rigid pawn structure and potentially create attacking avenues. Reactivating the light-squared bishop to prepare for potential pawn pushes on the king side, or to support a future advance of the g-pawn, while simultaneously untangling the pieces and aiming to improve the bishop's scope on the long diagonal. Reclaiming central influence, the knight pivots back to a more active square, preparing to support potential kingside advances or contest control of the d-file, while simultaneously safeguarding against any immediate tactical infringements on white's newly solidified pawn structure. Reclaiming the initiative on the queen file after the exchange, this maneuver aims to disrupt white's solidified pawn structure on the kingside, forcing a reaction and potentially opening lines for black's rooks. Exchanging queens now simplifies the position, leading to an endgame where white aims to exploit the exposed black king and potential pawn weaknesses, though black's bishop pair offers some counterplay. The exchange of queens is about to dramatically shift the battlefield's character, transforming this from a sharp middle-game skirmish into a strategic battleground where pawn structure and piece activity will reign supreme. Fulfilling the objective of seizing open lines, this knight maneuver aims to disrupt black's coordination by probing potential weaknesses on the kingside and preparing for future advances on the h-file. Trading off those active bishops simplifies the position drastically, setting the stage for an endgame where pawn structure and king activity will become paramount. Releasing the passed pawn with this exchange simplifies the position, transforming the battle into an endgame where white aims to leverage the queenside space advantage created by the earlier pawn push, aiming to advance it and create new threats against black's somewhat cramped king. The black king finally steps out of the shadows, seeking a more active role in this endgame where the board is significantly simplified. Asserting the open file control is paramount now, aiming to pressure black's isolated pawns and restrict their defensive options. Unlocking the central files and preparing a potential pawn advance with the king now safely nestled behind its pawns presents a solid strategy for the immediate future. Asserting dominance over the queen side, the rook slides to the second rank, aiming to exert pressure and potentially create passed pawns or exploit weaknesses in black's pawn structure. Shifting the king towards the center feels like an acknowledgement of the static pawn structure and a preparation for potential king activity in the ensuing endgame, rather than directly confronting the active rook on the 7th rank. Board potential opens up as the bishop aims to activate and pressure the kingside pawn structure. The black king, having ventured deep into enemy territory, now finds itself exposed on the 5th rank, a prime target for white's remaining pieces. This repositioning of the bishop aims to contest the open file and prevent black from consolidating their pawn majority on the queen side, It's a subtle but important maneuver to maintain attacking potential. KD4 is a daring foray for the king, stepping into the heart of White's territory to contest the central squares and potentially disrupt White's pawn structure, but it leaves him quite exposed to an attack. The bishop's redeployment to D5 aims to disrupt Black's kingside pawn structure and potentially create weaknesses that can be exploited later in the game. Embracing the endgame's raw power, Black solidifies their pawn structure on the kingside, a deliberate choice to counter White's potential advances and shore up weaknesses that could be exploited in the coming exchanges. Bringing the king to the center feels precarious, but is the best way to activate its defensive and offensive potential in this pawn-heavy endgame. Initiating the rook's advance to the 7th rank opens up exciting possibilities for creating a passed pawn, but be mindful of the kingside pawn structure becoming a target. Focusing the king toward the center now will help defend against any lingering pawn threats and potentially prepare for a more active role later on. Unlocking the king's path through a desperate pawn push sequence leads to a forced check, potentially creating immediate chaos or a subtle shift towards a more open endgame. The king bravely ventures forward, seeking a more active role in the endgame, but exposing itself to potential threats from Black's remaining pieces. Repositioning the rook to the 2nd rank offers excellent attacking potential, aiming to disrupt White's pawn structure and create new avenues for offense on the queen side. Seizing the open file allows White to penetrate Black's position and exert pressure on the rook and the pawn structure. Capturing the pawn on C4 initiates a daring pawn grab that, while temporarily adding material, critically exposes the Black king's shadow and opens avenues for White's remaining pieces to exploit the weakened dark squares on the kingside. The pawn structure is about to drastically change, opening up the long-term prospects of this rook endgame. The king, now exposed in the center after a dramatic pawn exchange, scrambles for safety, but the rooks are poised to exploit the open files and create decisive pressure. Initiating a careful repositioning of the monarch to a safer sector of the board before the remaining pawns become too problematic. The Black king, having ventured deep into enemy territory, now finds itself at the heart of a precarious, yet potentially powerful central presence. Finally, the rook finds a more active post, looking to exploit any weakness on the 7th rank. The pawn's forward march on the queen side creates a dangerous situation, potentially splitting White's remaining forces and opening new avenues for the Black rook. Embracing the open file with the rook, White aims to activate this piece and exert pressure on Black's now vulnerable pawn structure. The bishop finds a temporary respite, evading immediate capture and offering some defensive support to the pawn chain, though its long-term utility hinges on whether it can avoid becoming a target itself as the endgame consolidates. Reclaiming the king's central position, the rook ventures forward, aiming to penetrate enemy territory and create new attacking pathways while simultaneously supporting potential pawn advancements. Diving into the heart of the endgame, Black's king bravely ventures forth, seeking to become an active participant rather than a mere observer, aiming to disrupt White's pawns and potentially create new threats. Shifting the rook to the 6th rank clears the path for the king's escape and prepares to contest the critical queenside pawns. Hunkering down in this corner, Black seems to be aiming for a fortress, hoping to prevent White's king from accessing any profitable squares. Seeking to consolidate the king's newly acquired central outpost and prepare for potential exchanges that might arise from the repeated pawn structure. Snatching the pawn opens a dangerous diagonal for the Black queen, now poised to support a decisive push towards White's exposed king. Sacrificing material for king's safety is generally avoided, but in this endgame, White desperately needs to escape the looming checkmate threats. The Black king, feeling emboldened, ventures back into the fray, seeking to exploit the open lanes as the material dwindles and the pawn structure on the queenside begins to crumble. The king's safety becomes paramount as this rook shuffle aims to contain Black's advancing pawn storm and prepare for a potential counterplay. Black's bishop, now deeply entrenched, actively curbs White's central expansion and forces a careful retreat. a calculated decision to offer a rook exchange, aiming to simplify the position and potentially exploit the passed pawn. Suddenly, the black king scrambles for breathing room on the queen side, a desperate bid to escape the looming pawn storm and the suffocating pressure from white's centralizing pieces. Sacrificing material to establish a passed pawn on the queen side has been white's long-term plan, and this capture is the immediate payoff, creating a dangerous new threat. The pawn push advances, creating a passed threat and forcing white to react immediately to the looming passed c-pawn, potentially unraveling the pawn structure on the queen side. Seizing the passed pawn with the king appears to be the only logical continuation, though the resulting position still presents a significant challenge given the material deficit. Black crowning the queen is a desperate attempt to prolong the inevitable. With white's dominant pawn structure and the king safely tucked away, the material advantage will surely be converted. Clearing the e-file allows the rook to become a powerful attacking force, aiming to infiltrate the back ranks and exploit the advanced pawn. Unleashing a timely check, Black prioritizes immediate disruption and king's safety in this crucial endgame, forcing white to react and potentially disrupting any carefully laid plans for pawn advancement or piece repositioning. King's safety is paramount, forcing the monarch into a dangerous, exposed central position, where it becomes a prime target for the advanced queenside pawns. A vital regrouping maneuver, consolidating the queen's defensive shield before the imminent promotion threat. Pondering the implications of that rook maneuver, it seems to be a strategic repositioning to contest the critical central files, aiming to restrict Black's bishop's mobility and prepare for a potential endgame where rook activity will be paramount. A crucial decision arises as Black confronts the exposed monarch, a consequence of advancing pawns and disrupted piece harmony. Pivoting the monarch to a more secure corner offers a crucial defensive maneuver, preparing to weather the storm of Black's advancing passed pawn. Stepping back from the immediate skirmish on the king side, Black boldly redirects attention towards the critical pawn majority on the queen side, aiming to create a decisive passed threat. Pushing the rook forward here aims to solidify white's control over the 7th rank, a crucial positional goal, and simultaneously prepare for potential pawn advances or piece exchanges that could further exploit Black's less active king. Pushing the queen to the queenside now offers a potential endgame advantage, aiming to disrupt white's pawn structure and seek counterplay. The bishop's retreat now secures the central pawns, preparing to advance them with the support of the remaining rook. A timely check forces a concession, a last desperate grasp for initiative in a clearly lost position. Preserving the king's safety is paramount as the position simplifies, preventing any sudden swindles. The monarch scurries to safety, its pursuit a desperate chase across a fractured board, as the queen seeks one last thunderous check before the inevitable endgame. The king shuffles back, seeking refuge behind its own lines as the relentless queen continues to probe, setting up a potential trap should the opponent falter even slightly in their defense. The king's perilous journey continues, seeking refuge on the kingside once more, but a stark awareness of the open files and white's robust pawn structure looms large. This retreat, while perhaps psychologically comforting, offers little tangible defense against white's coordinated pieces. The rook retreats, seeking a safer perch to observe the unfolding pawn endgame, but it leaves its king momentarily exposed to potential checks from the queen. The queen retreats, abandoning the immediate assault on the weakened kingside and prioritizing preservation, potentially setting up a defensive fortress or preparing a regrouping maneuver to contest the open files. The king's newfound freedom on the open center, unburdened by pawn cover, beckons for a swift escort to safety, ideally behind a newly formed defensive structure or a pawn advance that shores up its exposed position.